because I always forget to do that. I'm going to pass the presenter role to you, Kyle.
Okay.
And okay, and I'm now going to also mute everyone else, and we will open up the mics later on. Okay, so Kyle, please.
All right. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so I've been working with Curling Canada for last quad actually, so last 4 years is my role of consultant for not just strength conditioning, but also starting to do a little more biomechanics work as well with the able-bodied and the wheelchair curling program. So I did do a webinar in February, and the topic of that one was off-season. So we're going to be switching over and talking a little bit more about what we need to be, what should be looked at, and what things to think about during the competitive season. Hopefully, if you were here during the off-season one, some of this will kind of flow through, and it'll make a little bit of sense. And if you weren't, you won't be lost. I will kind of explain myself as we go along here. So,
if anybody knocks, Kyle, you'll please allow them in.
Yes. Yeah. So,
I won't see it this time.
Yeah. No, yeah, we've added one more person.
Okay, great.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to get rid of the participants list that I had open. So the objectives for this webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about planning, and we can have some discussion later about balancing the competition schedule. We'll talk about maintaining fitness as being kind of the primary goal from a fitness standpoint. We'll talk a little bit warm up and cool down and how to manage fatigue. So I think I may have switched up the order of that, so it won't necessarily flow in that order, but we will touch all of these kind of topics. So when setting up your planning, ideally you want to try and create a competition plan that doesn't have a ton of density, especially in big blocks. If you can kind of spread that out, and sometimes you're depending on where the age of your athletes and the competitions that you have to go to in order to qualify for certain events or further events like provincial championships, you may need to attend those particular ones, and sometimes competition density in certain areas are unavoidable. Other things to think about as you're planning as well is, when is your technical training going to occur? When are you going to have on-ice practices? How long are they going to be? What's the density of that compared to the competition schedule? And then from a fitness perspective, if you've done the proper work during the off season, the focus should be strictly on maintenance for the most part, unless you have some breaks in your schedule. So when I set up an annual plan, and some of you hopefully will have seen different types of planning tools. So this is a portion of one that I would use. So I cut out the off-season piece, and I wanted to focus just on the in-season piece here. But you'll see that it pretty much flows. I've got the calendar weeks up on the top there, and they start with Mondays of each week. And you can see that I've kind of got this at week 22 of the calendar year is where I've got this starting. And then I like to identify the start and end dates of different bonspiels, where they are, so I kind of know with the team I'm working with, how much travel they might have to get there, and then, the name of the event. What I would then do, with that kind of looking towards the bottom here, is we've got a rating of importance. So the team would normally go in and rate these based on, where they feel those competitions, how important they go. So in this case, we'd probably label the Canada Cup as one of the highest priorities, but all of these master or the Grand Slam events will probably have a high, at least a 1 or a 2 level as well. for this particular group. And then we break it down over here into periods. So there's really just three: competitive, pre-competitive, and the transition period, which is usually a couple of weeks at the end of the season. Then phases get broken down. That varies from year to year. And then you have a focus for each phase. So because we're switching into an in-season, the focus is on maintenance, and the main piece that you're looking for is to maintain intensity in at this time, and cutting back significantly on volume from a fitness training perspective. So in general, with the rule of thumb that we tend to work with is about 50% of the volume is needed to maintain the fitness that you've built up throughout the year. So, in the off season where you were probably spending, 3 days a week or 4 days a week in the weight room lifting weights, and another 2 to 3 days of doing some kind of energy system training, you can cut right back down to as low as 2, and sometimes on a competition week, 1 time a week in the weight room, and 1 day of energy systems training. And that can be included. Energy systems training could easily be included into a technical portion of a practice by including some sweep intervals if ice time is flexible enough that you can make use of that as well. So then at the very bottom here, you'll see I've got a weekly focus. So I use 3 kind of labels to flow with here. I've got R, which is rest or recovery weeks. The small B, which is a lighter build, and then the big B, which is kind of a heavier build. So what you'd probably see is these recovery weeks. For sure, there's only going to be 1. With the smaller B on a competition week, is probably going to be 1, but maybe a little bit more volume than the recovery week was. And then this bigger B will definitely be 2, maybe even 3, coming into a window where they've got another week of recovery here. So early in the season, I'm okay with that. And again, it would depend on what the label. This autumn gold event is a lower one, coming off of a non-point dependent event from the Elite 10. So they're probably not as high a priority with that team, and we would allow for almost like not a true train through, but we would have a little bit more volume there. Intensity is probably already set at this point, so we're not going to build up more intensity as we go along. And then we'd flow through. So I only took you through to kind of what the planned schedules are. After Christmas, you get into with the national team athletes, their provincial championships, and then it really depends on whether or not they're representing their province or not as to how busy they go from there. Sometimes if they don't succeed in their provincial playdowns, they've got another decent block of time where we can actually do a little bit of in-season building. If they're on to provincials, then it's a pretty heavy schedule through that the season of champions portion of the schedule. So, as you're thinking, part of the challenge that we want to be accomplishing as coaches is to provide a continuous training and competition schedule, so the stimulus to get the progression and the adaptations that we want. We want to facilitate that optimum performance at the right times. We want them to peak for those events. And like I said, those higher priority ones are obviously the ones that we really want to peak for. I mean, all competitions, the athletes want to obviously win, but some of them will have, you can go in with a little bit of fatigue and not feel as like that's going to be detrimental the entire season. We definitely want to avoid what's called overtraining syndrome, and I'll kind of expand on that a little bit. And along with that is we want to minimize the risk of injuries. Nothing is more detrimental to performance than injury. So we'll talk a little bit about overtraining syndrome. So this is a condition that's characterized, primarily by a decrease in performance. That can be in practice or, even worse in competition, where we start to see a decrease or a decline in how the athlete's performing. It can also be increased effort to deliver the same performance. So they're not necessarily not getting the results, but it's taking a bigger toll on the athlete to get those results. And certainly, failing to show progression or improvements when you're in more of a build time is another area of concern. That, there are situations where fitness parameters do plateau, and that may also be the case. But I would say that, we may not have, a lot of the athletes may not be pushing quite to those types of levels. So certainly from my end of things, my expectations for most of the curling athletes don't take them to the plateau end of things on most of our fitness parameters. So what does this look like? Typically, you would have some kind of a training stimulus or a competition stimulus. You would provide an adequate recovery, and there's no set in stone here. And then you would have an increase, and we would see an improvement in performance. When we have too much stimulus, and not an adequate enough or an inadequate enough recovery relative to that stimulus, and then we repeat that over and over, we can start to see a decrease in performance. And that's really, what we want to be paying attention to sometimes, is where does that start to happen? And, sometimes in your training year during the off season, you push and you expect a decrease in some performance parameters, but you're using that to build up for a bigger return later on. So you give adequate amount of rest relative to that. If we go beyond overreaching, right, we can get into a pretty serious issue, which is called overtraining. The overtraining syndrome often leads to similar to what we see in the overreaching, but when we give them the appropriate rest values, we don't get the recovery. So even if we gave them 2 or 3 weeks off, we don't see improvements. And I would say that, I've been working in sport for, well over a decade now, coming on to two decades, and I have not had any athletes get to what I would consider an overtrained status, where we had to give them, a year. It usually takes about a year's worth of relative rest, in order to get back from that. So it's very rare, and it usually happens, in sports with pretty extreme volumes of training. None of our curling athletes, I would expect to get into that. Certainly, if you're dealing with, high school aged athletes or younger, where they're playing lots of different sports, you may come across points where they may get into an overreaching component. The other thing to remember is that, even though this is written down as a training stimulus, we could call that competition stimulus, really we're talking about all different types of stress. So you could be carrying a relatively normal stress load, but if that person's going through other times of the year that are extremely stressful, whether it's a new stress or an expected stress, like say an exam period in high school or university, and you haven't accounted for that properly, that can put them into an overreaching situation. Same thing if you're dealing with multi-sport athletes, so athletes that are, not just curling, but they could be playing hockey, they could be playing all different types of high school sports. Those are things to be wary of as well. So watching for some of the signs and symptoms of overreaching. If you feel like your athletes are getting having a lot of physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress, these are some of the things that you can kind of look for. So decreased performance is, kind of one of those first indicators that we talked about. Some of these are going to be relatively hard for you to measure, but just that they can happen. So decrease in aerobic power. Probably not as relevant for curling, but it can happen. Decrease in economy, so that kind of goes along with that extra effort to get the same performance component. So if all of a sudden you see, your front end is sweeping and getting the results they normally would, but they're coming out and they're breathing heavier than they ever have, and not looking like they're fully quite ready to go the next time, those might be early indicators of starting to see some overreaching points. Decrease in appetite, again, that's another tough one to monitor on a regular basis unless you're taking food records with your athletes. Certainly increase in injury. You start to see, more strains happening, so muscle injuries, overuse injuries. Increase infection. So, if your athlete's starting to get colds more frequently, their immune system starts to get worn down, so they're more susceptible to that. And I've actually seen a couple of our athletes who, we've been able to look back at some of the data, and I'll talk about how we monitor some of this data. And we could have predicted that the athlete was susceptible to getting a cold, and it's happened in the past with them. Increased resting heart rate. So some athletes and coaches, Fitbit uses are more common, Apple Watches are more common for people to wear them fairly regularly, so you can get resting heart rates on a fairly regular basis. So if we start to see that creeping up, that's a sign that it could be starting to see some overreaching. Increased submaximal lactate values. So the measurement of the aerobic power is difficult. This one is hard to measure, but you can see this visually, and this is where I'm talking about starting to see your athletes struggle, especially from the front end. Typically, when we're in a sweeping situation, curlers don't get into the anaerobic lactic energy system. So their body's not producing a lot of high lactate values. The rest in between generally is enough to, if they do happen to sweep, a 15, 20 second rock, and they really start to max out their alactic system, the lactic system may kick in a little bit, but there's usually plenty of recovery time that it's not a substantial issue. But when we start to get into overreaching, because the aerobic system is the primary means of recovering that lactic system, the alactic system, if it's not able to recover that piece, we might start to see our athletes go a little bit more anaerobic. And the best way to get rid of the acidity that's associated with high lactate values is to breathe out quicker. So if you see your athletes really struggling, having a lot of really heavy and rapid breathing at the end of their sweeping beyond kind of what you'd see on a regular basis, that's another confirmation that we may be in a situation of some overreaching. If this happens in one game, I'm not concerned, but if it's happening through an entire game and into the second game, then we're starting to have some concerns about what's going on. And a change in max heart rate, again, that's not something that, unless they're regularly recording that you'll probably be concerned with. From a psychological perspective, disturbed sleep, change in mood. So, if they're, a little more irritable than normal, again, this is where knowing your athletes really well is helpful. Increase in perceived exertion. I said I'd talk a little bit about monitoring. So that's a method of tracking that's very commonly used. Depression and irritability, increased need for sleep. They just can't seem to, get enough, and they're always tired and always looking to take naps and just, having difficulty getting out of bed. Again, if we're probably thinking, well, I'm dealing with teenagers, that can be an issue all the time, but these are variations from what their normal fluctuations could be. Loss of training desire. So, you lose a desire to get out to practice, lose a desire to compete and participate as well. So we can avoid this by obviously adding more recovery days in if you feel like, you've got that the situation starting to arise. Periodizing our annual year, which we've already kind of shown you, is extremely valuable, right? Planning ahead of time I can't say enough about it. It needs to be on everybody's radar, and everybody should be using some kind of an annual plan to set themselves up and and program in and have an idea of where they can have higher and lower amounts of work. Increasing the variety. So, if you're always, if practice tends to be the same drills over and over and over again, that can not only wear on and over from a physical perspective, but also from a mental perspective. So adding variety in, changing up the drills, changing up how you're flowing with things. Ensure volume intensity have an inverse relationship. So as intensity goes up, volume should come down. Avoid overworking one area. It kind of goes along with the variety piece, right? So make sure that you're switching things up. And then avoid excessive eccentric work. There isn't a significant eccentric, and eccentric means there's kind of three types of muscle actions when you move. Whenever your body is lowering with gravity, that your muscles are lengthening, that's an eccentric component. So on the curling sheet, we don't get a lot of eccentric work, but certainly, if you're including anything like downhill running or really, slow movements in the weight room, those are types of eccentric work. And they produce a significant amount of muscle damage and lead to exhaustion and a little bit quicker. Great during the off season, should really be avoided during the competitive season. So we want to avoid all that. So the best ways to do that is by planning, and then you want to make sure that your plan is being executed and going the way you want to. So monitoring is a way to follow up with that. So you'll set your daily and weekly training loads, and then you can use a variety of different tools to monitor that. So we use a commercial product, and I'll kind of show you some of the screenshots how we should use that information. But one of the basic components of that, well, there's two pieces that we use. One's a wellness questionnaire, and you can look those up. They're easy to look up online. And then we look at training load. And training load is really just how long was your training session, and how would you rate that on a scale of 1 to 10? So that's your rating of perceived exertion. So we have all of our athletes from a fitness and strength and conditioning perspective. All the athletes that I work with, their curlers, are not typically rank their strength training sessions and their conditioning sessions on a scale of 1 to 10, and then they mark down how long that session was. So if you did 10 minutes at an RPE of 5, you'll end up with a training load score of 50. Right? That would be a pretty low training score. Typically you'd be like 30-minute, 60-minute sessions, but those kind of accumulate as you go. One other thing you can look at as you're monitoring is rocks thrown in a practice, rocks thrown in a week, and you can tabulate those. The data can have power, but it really only has power if it's consistently monitored. So if you miss weeks of information, you're not going to be able to plot that, and you're not going to be able to see whether or not your athlete's showing some signs of excess fatigue. So like I said, there are commercial products out there, but there are certainly a lot of ways to monitor that without commercial products. There's plenty of, if you Google wellness questionnaires, you'll get all kinds of different examples. Through the Canadian Sports Centre in Manitoba that I work for, we use a product called Athlete Monitoring. In the East Coast, there's a company called, actually Athlete Monitoring is also from New Brunswick. Nova Scotia, there's a company called Conduct that has a product as well. And there are a few other ones. The basic premise of some of these is some kind of a wellness questionnaire. So that's the picture on the right here. And the wellness questionnaire will have a series of different questions. And they would typically cover sleep quality, sleep or sleep quantity, sleep quality, mood. How are you feeling today? You know, how sore do you feel? Ratings of happiness. And usually it would have some kind of a descriptor that you would pick. So in this particular shot here, you'd say, how do you feel today? And, you know, you've got not fresh, not at all, feel very fresh. Do you feel tired today? Not at all, feel very fresh. No, I feel fresh, normal, more tired than normal. I feel exhausted. So you can see that, you know, if you keep picking the red categories, eventually when we amalgamate those, you're going to end up with a suspected, you know, we as coaches are going to suspect that you're starting to show signs of fatigue and getting into the overreaching components, and maybe we need to back off. Well, not maybe, we will need to back off either on at the immediate training session, or definitely altering up as we go along through the week. If you're able to track this on a fairly regular basis, something as simple as, you know, using open-ended questions is how you're feeling today. That can, you know, give you some insight into, you know, how your athlete's doing, at least on the immediate component, and whether or not, you know, getting to know your athlete really well, you may be able to use that as a means of monitoring and potentially adjusting how you go. So the athlete monitoring software gives us this lovely view. And I know this looks fairly complicated, but really all of these columns are your training loads. So you can see that this particular athlete has recorded training loads. This athlete was actually really very good at consistently recording data. So this was a particular block of time around the holidays when they were off for the most part. So it's not that they weren't recording, they just weren't. Those were days off of training for the holidays. And you can see that, you know, there was a significant break of time, and this was actually the athlete I was talking about who came back and, you know, at this point had a significant decrease in work volume, came back to what was a fairly normal work volume, and this person actually got cold somewhere around the week after this. So they were low volume, came back with a high volume, started to get a little bit immunocompromised and got a cold. That doesn't mean that the athlete was guaranteed to get a cold. It just happened that, you know, she was a little depressed and encountered someone who had a cold virus. So a little bit of bad luck along with that. So we could look at that data. Looking back at that data, we could easily tell that coach now the next year, saying, okay, you know, coming back from your Christmas holiday break, we might want to decrease the initial loading volume and ease the athletes back in a little bit, rather than jumping back into you know, what was close to normal work volumes. So that's the power of having solid data to back that up. So we get a couple of things out of this. I took the wellness piece out, so you see this is kind of grayed out here. So the wellness score kind of flows through here as well, but when I put it in, it shrinks all of these other values. And this black line here depicts what's called an acute to chronic work to rest ratio. So it looks at all of the loads that have happened in the last month, the last 28 days, relative to the last 7 days. And it tells us whether or not the athlete is nearing a state or getting into a state of overreaching. So wherever it goes above 1.5, and especially if it gets close to 2, the athlete's at significant risk. So you can see this line here represents 2 on the scale, and this athlete right around the point where she got the cold was into that risk zone. So the data was telling us that, you know, she was getting too much load. So when our athletes are inputting the information appropriately, we can then come back to the coach and give them some useful information to that. So it's a pretty cool system. I can't say that all our athletes are as good as this athlete at collecting data. That's why I kind of picked her data, because she is a good record keeper, and that's what I say, that the power in this type of information is collecting it regularly. If it's not collected regularly, then we can't come back and look and predict when an athlete is going to be fatigued or not fatigued. So one of the other things that when we're thinking about the competitive season and some of the tools that we're going to put into place to help decrease the risk of injury and manage fatigue is to include a proper warm-up before competition and before practices. So here are some of the examples of why we want to warm up. So when the tissue temperature reaches a certain point, we end up with improved muscular contraction. So they actually, from a neurological perspective, they contract quicker. We also get a relaxation of both agonist and antagonist muscles. So agonist muscles are your primary movers, and your antagonist muscles are the muscles that oppose that. So if you think of it from like a bicep curl, as you're moving your arm up, your agonist would be your biceps, and your antagonist would be your triceps. Anytime we move a joint, we have co-contraction. So muscles on both sides of the joint, those that are moving it and those that are opposing it, are contracting. And that gives us stabilization in our joints. But if in the case of a bicep curl, if your triceps are contracting, they're actually making your biceps work harder. So we want to have relaxation of those antagonist muscles in order to produce more force into that movement as well. So we get improvements of contraction and relaxation of those muscles. We get improvements in the rate of force development and reaction time, improvements in muscular strength and power. They have a lowered viscosity of the muscles. So muscles act kind of as a solid and a liquid at the same time. So as the tissue temperature's up, muscle fibers flow and move over each other more easily. We get improved oxygen delivery, which enhances aerobic contribution to the to the exercise, increased blood flow, and enhanced metabolic reactions. So lots of plus here when we increase the temperature. So getting a thorough warm-up is extremely valuable. So there are two components when we think of a warm-up. There's a general warm-up, which is your low-intensity aerobic type exercises, and spending 5 to 10 minutes in those activities is usually enough to get your heart rate up and your core temperature starting to rise, and gets you ready for the more specific components. So the specific includes the dynamic stretching exercises that hopefully everybody's doing, and different dynamic movements. And the intensity of the specific part of this increases as you roll through the warm-up, so that by the time you're finishing, you're performing activities at near the types of speeds and power that you would want in your activity. So you can, even before we get to this, we can also have pre-activities that can include foam rolling, trigger point release with lacrosse ball, mobility exercises. Now I say can because some of those types of activities are really as needed component. So if your athlete isn't dealing with any really specific tightnesses, doesn't have any active trigger points that need releasing, you don't necessarily have to include those. From my point of view, some strength coaches will say, and fitness professionals say you should do all these things all the time, but the data the research doesn't support that. But if your athlete have some tightness and enjoys this component of a warm-up, then certainly it allows for it does have benefits for those who are dealing with those tightnesses, and allows you to kind of get into the mindset of and getting ready to focus in on the competition. It's important to know that everybody is different, and that warm-ups, although maybe early in a curler's life and in a curling team's life, it might be useful to have everybody going together for accountability, for team bonding. Eventually, I like the athletes to reflect and think about what their needs are and how they need to be warm up and prepared. You'll often see that most of the national team program athletes, the slam curling teams, the athletes often go off and do their own individual warm-ups and get themselves ready. And they've learned how to do those over the years and ensure that they're ready to go. So this is an example of a warm-up that I created for a member of a national team program team, and this one's from a fairly long time ago. It's actually a couple of Roar of the Rings ago that we created this one, and we set it up ideally so that it can be done in as small of a distance as a 3 by 3 meter location. So if all you had was the front of the space at the end of a sheet of ice, and that's the only place that you can warm up, so there's everything's kind of set by distance. The general one was a 5-minute piece. Everyone can do that together. And then the dynamic piece, so we go through a series of dynamic stretch components, which are a little bit slower. And then we start getting into more of the activation, higher intensity exercise. So it really starts with slow, controlled movements here, stretches that aren't held, dynamic stretches, moving into more explosive, more dynamics to get into some hop skips, you get into double hops, single leg hops, standing long jumps. It's really just standing and jumping as far as you can. And then an exercise that I like is just a hack jump. So think of dropping down into the hack and driving off of one leg. You can take that and progress that to some on ice sweeping if you want to when you're on ice practice hits, if you're in a game or during before a practice. You'll see that sometimes in here we include some banded movements. You could substitute those in and add push-ups. There's a lot of different potential variations of this, and this was just one example that we had. So I like using the elastic resistance during the warm-up to add an upper body component to some of the lower body stuff just to save some time as well. So, all of this would take about 10 minutes. You may not get through all these exercises. The athlete could pick and choose which ones they want to do on that particular given day. A video example. So if you're taking the Comp Dev course, and if you've taken it, you've seen some of these. If you haven't taken it, you will see this particular piece. But just some examples, exercises. Being open up and warm up the hip, what are called abductors, and
Kyle, you break up during the video portion and then you come back after the video is done.
Okay. So I'll pause it then. Is it better when I'm paused?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. It's just probably my Wi-Fi gets maxed out with the video play. So saying lunges are extremely valuable. I like that. It is very similar to the movement of driving out of the hack, so it helps loosen up and warm up those hips. The side lunges that we just saw helps again loosen up the groin more primarily and put some activation into the exterior glutes to help continue warming out of that. I'll let little movement. So again, those are the types of ones we want to do at the beginning and not so much at the end. Like I said, putting in push-ups. in our body. So there's a number of different things that we can incorporate into, and there are plenty of resources available to help find some different activities if you're looking. Certainly, YouTube has a lot of good, high quality stuff and a lot of questionable stuff. So if anybody's really looking for good website or for good YouTube spaces, just let me know and I can point you to one or two better channels. So after practice or after an event, we can think about a cool down phase, and I'll talk a little bit about this. So the purpose of a cool down is to return to baseline, what we call return to homeostasis. So you could have, we want to decrease heart rate if it's elevated. We want to decrease blood pressure if it's elevated. In most cases, a lot of the time we're coming to the end of the game, you may be at a point where you're not really that far from baseline to begin with. So overemphasizing those pieces might not even be a necessity. Some of the other things that can happen with a cool down is the removal of metabolic waste if present, enhanced recovery. So I should put a question mark there because it be helpful depending on the state that you're coming out in. So we can add in some the methods of cool down. So if you feel like there was an extremely heavy game and there was plenty of sweeping, and the athletes really burn themselves out early in the year, you might have an active recovery period where you're doing some light aerobic activity. It's also a time when you can add in some static stretching components, foam rolling, areas of tightness, and nutrient replenishment is probably the most important thing to be focused on at the end of a game or end of a practice. So if you don't have time for any of the other stuff, especially if you're in between games, getting in nutrient replenishment should be the number one focus here. So like I said, we want to return to what's called homeostasis, which is really kind of your resting state on a pre-work state. Regeneration is repairing any of their damaged tissue. So we can create optimal recovery by a couple of different methods. One, we can have passive rest, which is basically just doing nothing. We can have active rest, like I said, a light, low intensity aerobic exercise. All right, but there is risk to doing that too. If you're active, then you're not able to replenish glycogen stores, which is your nutrient values. So if you've got a short window for the in between games, you don't want to be doing any light aerobic activities. You just won't have the time for that, and you may inhibit the nutrient recovery, which is a more important piece. Massage is a kind of a longer term recovery strategy, so not necessarily post game components, but if your athletes have the ability to see a massage therapist on a regular basis, and that can help with muscle relaxation, deactivating, hitting active trigger points, improving their overall function. Thermotherapy, so using heat, can be used. Again, I would trial and error with it. There's not a lot of positive results, but these are just examples of some things that people have used. Cryotherapy, so using cold, ice tubs are pretty common, or ice application on specific areas. Useful in acute injury treatments, but as an overall recovery component, isn't really that warranted. Fairly common is what's called contrast therapy, so go from hot to cold to hot to cold, and there are different ratios out there. Like I said, it is used quite frequently, and there aren't a lot of research studies. If you dig into the literature, you probably see an equal number of studies that show a positive result and equal numbers that show no result. So what the magical value, if there is, or formula, hasn't really been hammered down yet. So it's one of those ones where, if there's interest, or an athlete has, experienced it and enjoys it, the enjoyment component of it may be enough to give it some validation, even though it may not necessarily be having a real effect. If it's having a placebo effect, then that's still a positive thing. And then for me, and I think our dietitian would agree with me. Nutrition is probably should be the number one priority when we're dealing with post-game stuff. And again, that's, especially during a Bonspiel, you may not have back-to-back games, but you certainly have some the next day. So you want to make sure that you're getting that energy source in as quickly as possible, ideally within 30 to 40 minutes. Or sooner. And stuff like chocolate milk, you've probably heard this many times, but it does have a great ratio of carbohydrates to protein, and helps with maintaining or preventing protein breakdown and replenishing the glycogen stores, and getting you ready for the next game. So I think I've left some time for questions.
That's awesome. I have a funny story about chocolate milk, Kyle.
Yeah.
At Trillium Curling Camp years ago, the staff used to play a game after the kids were in bed. It was called If I Roll a One. And one of the people said, well, if I roll a one, then you have to do a talk about chocolate milk and how you have to shake it for 10 seconds before it will do any good in recovery. So this person got up the next day and in front of the whole camp advised everybody that if you didn't shake your chocolate milk container for 10 seconds, at least you weren't going to get any benefit from it. So somebody else that had been at the camp was then at a skating competition. And there were one or two people there drinking chocolate milk, and they were shaking it for 10 seconds first.
That's funny.
So the word had spread that far. Anyway, that's a sidebar. So I'm going to unmute everybody. And before I do that, just if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. And if not, Kyle, you'd be happy to answer via email?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so are there any questions, please?
I can hardly hear the question.
Yeah, can you use the chat box at the top if you're asking a question, just for the moment, for the person that was asking? Oh, okay. Question here. What are your thoughts on having a nap between games? Does it slow down your metabolism too much?
No, I wouldn't worry about the metabolism piece. Well, not from anything that I've ever read. Napping certainly can have its benefits. There's generally two types of naps. There's a long nap, which needs to have at least be a full sleep cycle, which is about 90 minutes. And then there's a short nap, which shouldn't be any more than 30 minutes, and preferably about between 20 and 30. So the short nap is, helps you, can be helpful to kind of get you through a period of mental fatigue. And the longer nap would be more if you're sleep deprived. But there's a risk. Those long naps, if you don't go through a full sleep cycle and you wake up during some deep sleep, it can take, sometimes greater than an hour to get out of that feeling of, that feeling that you haven't had enough sleep. So napping is something that shouldn't be done without some practice. So you don't want to just add that in without having experimented with it at some point. So It's very common in hockey, right? Where they have morning skate, they go off, they have their nap, and then they come back. So, but that's a habituated nap.
Kyle, can you hear me? It's Scotty.
Yes.
Question. I've got an under 18 boys team, and after 4 or 5 ends, you're going to give them a snack. What would be detrimental, and what would be a good thing for them in such a 5-minute break?
During practice or during a game?
During a game.
Like during the 5th end break or something like that?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean that's taking breaks is always going to be helpful, and having a lot of most teams have a snack during the 5th end break.
Mm-hmm.
And the snacks, whenever I have the benefit of working with an extremely talented dietitian who works with our national team program. She also happens to, work with me at the Canadian Sports Center in Manitoba. So, she plans out all of the athletes' meals and talks about their snacks and things like that. And I've listened to her many times. So when you're planning out snacks, it has to be something, again, it's something that the athlete has tried and knows that it isn't something that's going to irritate them. It's going to provide them the nutrition that they want. So it's, again, just like anything, you don't want to be experimenting during a bonspiel unless it's one of those lower importance ones.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, snacking during the 5th end break or 4th end break, whatever it happens to be, is very common and very useful. Even grazing during, so you'll often see a lot of the athletes have like an energy bar, or granola bar or something, and they'll pop off, when they're done and they're waiting, and they'll grab a little bite here and there. It's very helpful because we know our events are really long. You've got 2 to 3 hours for a game. You need to keep up with the nutrition, not just for the muscle energy component of it too, but also for keeping your blood sugar levels elevated so that you're mentally sharp.
Thank you.
What about waking up your mind and your body for early morning games, Kyle? What do you recommend
for me? Yeah, it's about getting enough sleep the night before, right?
Right.
So that's a key number one, and sometimes that's easy to say and not as easy to do because you're on the road, you're not sleeping in your own bed. You maybe, when you're dealing with younger teens, you're sharing a room. There's all kinds of challenges to sleeping on the road and traveling on the road. So some people, will experiment a little bit with the cold shower technique. Caffeine, even though I joke, is a stimulant, so that can, help wake up the nervous system and get you sharp. But getting an adequate amount of sleep is appropriate. You can make do with 1 or 2 nights of rougher sleep, but that will catch up to you eventually throughout especially a longer event.
Perfect, thank you. When traveling to a spiel that involves jet lag, how many days would it take to recover from jet lag? How do you mitigate the jet lag?
It's a good question. Especially, and it doesn't, we often think of traveling overseas with jet lag, but, we've got a pretty big country. So if you're traveling from the West Coast to the East Coast or vice versa, you can have some jet lag there. I would say, the more significant the time difference between one location and the other, one common strategy is to start time shifting before you travel. And I don't have those, the numbers in front of us. We have a few different formulas that we use, but, let's say it's a 5-hour time difference. If you're going from one end of the country to the other, you may want to start 4 or 5 days out of starting to time shift yourself so that you can get to, by the time you're ready to go, you're kind of living on that time zone already. And that certainly is helpful with prepping yourself. I'd say that that's probably one of the best ways to get around the jet lag. Now, as far as how to recover if you don't have to take that approach, that's a very somewhat of an individual, but if you're traveling west, if you can keep yourself up as long as you can before the day of the travel, and getting yourself, trying to get yourself as close to that sleep schedule as possible has shown to be helpful with some individuals. But planning ahead of time and doing the sleep, doing the time zone shift is probably the best way.
I've also heard that, taking something like melatonin when you get to your destination to help you sleep, because often you'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. But there again, that's, to take a melatonin then to help you get back to sleep. But you need to, A, consult with the doctor, and B, find out how you react to melatonin before you get going.
Yeah, melatonin is, it's not a prescribed component. It gets naturally released by the body as you start to enter into your sleep times. So as you approach night, your body starts to know that your circadian rhythms, your daily rhythms kick in, and your body starts to know, yes, I'm getting to my sleep. So melatonin gets released, and it puts you into that sleep phase. So yeah, melatonin has been used at times. Using, if you're on longer flights and you know that you're going to be on especially going overseas, some positions and some teams have used sleep aids to get themselves through those overnight trips as well, and force sleep when you normally wouldn't, and then wake up kind of in the morning where you are and onto the time zone that you are, and that sometimes has worked as well with some success. But that's usually if you're only traveling for greater than an 8-hour flight, because most of those sleep medications like Zopiclone will put you out for a good 8 hours. So you don't want to be waking up, and you don't want to be landing and still being asleep after a 5-hour flight.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, I'm not hearing anything, so if anybody does have any other questions, oh, wait, we have one. How can you minimize brain fog and getting chilled when you are on your third game of the day, body is warm, trying to hydrate, and then it looks like your athletes hit a mental wall?
That's a good question. Avoid events that have 3 games in a day. No.
Don't get into tiebreakers.
Yeah, that's hard, right? Like, it's hard to simulate and train for that, right? Like, it's hard to plan out a few training days where you work and have that length of time. So it's probably one of those situations where everybody's in the same boat if they've played 3 that day. If your athletes are caffeine drinkers, then you can look into utilizing caffeine. But that also then puts you at a risk of being up late into the night. But if you take it early enough before that third game, then you may be able to kind of ride through it.
Okay.
It sounds like he's asking more, but you're going to have to type it because you sound like you're like 200 miles away.
Which he probably is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Probably more than that, I would imagine.
Yeah. Okay, unless I see another question, we're going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank you, Kyle. Your sessions are always extremely informative, and we will be sharing the recording with everybody who's on the call right now, and also those who registered but weren't able to attend. So any other questions, please gather them together for yourself kind of thing, and send them to Kyle so that he's not getting a million emails from each of you, sort of thing. Like, send your individual emails, but try to gather your questions together. So I'm going to stop the recording right now, and at least I'm